My name is Yashel Kaur, and for 100 years my people asked the same question about humans. We asked it in our war academies, where instructors used them as a case nobody could quite solve. We asked it in our command rooms, in whispers between officers who did not want to sound like they respected an enemy we had never truly tested. Why does the strongest fleet in known space refuse to fight a real war? Every other species we had ever met eventually showed us their limit. Push hard enough, and something breaks. Humanity was the only people whose limit nobody had ever found, and a century of not knowing had made my whole empire uneasy in a way we rarely admitted out loud. I did not expect to be the one who finally learned the answer. I certainly did not expect to learn it while drifting, half-conscious, aboard my own crippled flagship, looking up at a human medical officer whose eyes held something closer to sadness than victory. But this story deserves to be told in order, the way it happened to me. I served as sub-commander under Fleet Marshal Dravoth, a proud officer of the Karathi Dominion. We are not a young empire, and we are not a gentle one. My people are built for hierarchy and endurance, not for doubt. And for generations we have trusted strength the way humans seem to trust patience. Long before humans ever left their own moon, we had conquered 11 star systems, and we had never once needed to ask a people twice to yield. Every civilization we met eventually showed us the edge of its strength. That was simply how the galaxy worked, older than any treaty we had ever signed. Humanity broke this rule without appearing to notice they were breaking it. In the 100 years since first contact, they had faced border disputes and small provocations from a dozen powers, including my own dominion. They had never once answered with their full strength. Every other species had a ceiling we could measure and plan around. Humanity's ceiling was a mystery, and mysteries like that make old empires nervous. Dravoth believed he understood the mystery better than anyone. He believed humans were simply broken somewhere inside, that some old exhaustion in their history had left them unable to fight the way the rest of us could. I remember him saying this on the bridge of our flagship, the Ashen Crown, while we watched a human trade convoy pass peacefully through contested space that any other people would have defended by force. A tired species mistakes its tiredness for wisdom, he told me. They call it peace. I call it a wound that never properly healed. I did not fully agree with him. I also did not argue. That silence is the part of this story I am least proud of. 6 months ago, Dravoth decided he had waited long enough to test his theory. He chose a small human settlement near the edge of their territory, a farming colony called Corwin's Reach, lightly defended and far from any major fleet. His plan, in his own mind, was almost gentle. We would not aim for the colonists. We would strike only their orbital defense grid, disable their shields, and then wait. If humanity truly was what he believed, they would plead for peace, or say nothing at all. If he was wrong, he told the assembled officers, we would learn that cheaply too, before it ever became a real war. I stood beside him when he gave that order. I remember how quiet our bridge became, the way a room goes quiet before something it already expects to enjoy. We had grown used to easy victories across 11 conquered systems, and this felt, to everyone around me, like one more. The colony's shields fell in under an hour. Their small defense fleet, 6 aging cruisers built for patrol rather than real combat, could not match our numbers and did not pretend otherwise. We watched their ships go dark, one by one, without much resistance. True to his word, Dravoth allowed time for the colonists to reach their ground shelters before declaring the exercise complete. Then he turned to me with something close to real joy in his eyes. You see, Yashel? A century of frightening stories, and this is what we find underneath them. Nothing. Something twisted quietly in my chest just then. Something I did not yet have a proper word for. It was not doubt, not exactly. It was quieter than doubt, and far harder to ignore. On the surface feeds relayed to our bridge, I saw the colonists moving toward their shelters in neat, practiced lines. The way people move when they have rehearsed a plan many times before and hoped never to need it. There was no panic in those pictures, no chaos of the kind I had seen on a dozen other worlds during a dozen other campaigns. It struck me, even then, as strange. Conquered peoples usually scatter. These people simply walked, calmly, toward safety, as though they trusted their own shelters more than they feared us. We did not have long to enjoy that victory. There was no warning, no approaching fleet on our sensors, no broadcast demanding surrender, no countdown of any kind. Space simply changed around us, the way it does when something far more advanced than your own instruments decides to stop hiding from them. A single human ship appeared at the edge of our formation, smaller than our own flagship, older in design than anything Dravoth had planned for. Its hull carried a name in the human alphabet that our translators struggled to place. When I later asked our fleet historian what it meant, she told me it was the name of a city. one that had never needed defending again after the day it fell, because nothing had ever attacked it a second time. She would not explain further, and something careful in her voice told me not to ask her twice. What happened next took 11 minutes. I know the exact number because I counted them myself, the way soldiers sometimes count the things they cannot yet properly understand. That single ship did not aim for our hulls, and it did not aim for our crews. It aimed for our weapons, our engines, and our shield generators, one system at a time, across our entire fleet, with a precision that felt less like combat and more like surgery performed on a patient who had already agreed to the procedure. Ship after ship of ours went quiet in turn, engines failing, weapons falling silent, crews shaken but whole. Our own flagship's cannons failed before Dravoth could finish the order to fire them. I watched targeting systems that had never once failed in my service go dark within the same second, across every deck at once. Around me, officers who had never known real defeat sat frozen at their stations, staring at screens that no longer answered them. Nobody aboard that human vessel spoke to us. There was no demand for surrender, no announcement of victory, no order for us to stand down. When our weapons finally stopped working, the ship simply held its position, almost patiently, as though waiting for us to notice on our own that the engagement was already finished. Dravoth would not accept this. I do not think he was able to. He ordered a small boarding party launched from a support vessel at the rear of our formation, one of the only offensive tools we had left that still worked. I do not know what he expected to prove by it. I only know that the shuttle carrying that boarding party was stopped gently, its engines disabled at a careful distance, left drifting harmlessly until our own crews recovered it hours later. Nobody aboard was harmed. The human ship could have ended that shuttle in an instant, and instead chose only to make certain it never reached wherever it had been sent. That was the moment I understood we were not fighting an enemy at all. We were being corrected, the way a patient teacher corrects a student who has misunderstood a lesson badly enough to risk hurting themselves by it. Our own flagship was struck last, and struck lightly, just enough to leave us drifting but whole. I was thrown from my station and struck my head against a support beam. I do not remember losing consciousness so much as slowly noticing that the sound around me had changed from urgent alarms to a strange and total quiet. When I woke, I was aboard a human vessel, resting in a small, clean room lit with soft light, a simple chair placed beside my bed, that I later learned was meant for visitors who wished to sit quietly with the injured, rather than simply examine them. My uniform had been folded neatly on a nearby table. Nobody had removed my insignia. Nobody, as far as I could tell, had searched me for information of any kind. I lay there for a long while, confused by how unafraid I felt, and confused further by how strange that feeling was to me. A human entered the room after some time, an officer I later came to know as Commander Ellen Vasco, who introduced herself not as my captor but as the ship's senior historian, a role I did not know human fleets even kept aboard their warships. She had calm, steady eyes and an even calmer voice, the kind used by people who have delivered difficult truths many times before, and long ago learned not to soften them into comfortable lies. I asked her the only question that truly mattered to me by then: why? Why had they disabled us so carefully, system by system, instead of simply ending us outright? Why spare our boarding party, when sparing it cost them nothing to avoid? Why let one small colony fall, and then simply stop, without punishment, without demand, without so much as a single warning sent to the rest of the watching galaxy? She did not answer right away. Instead, she asked whether I truly wanted to understand, or whether I only wanted an explanation short enough to repeat back to my fleet marshal. I told her the truth. I wanted to understand. What she showed me next was not classified information, and it was not some clever piece of propaganda meant to impress a captured officer. It was simply history, the same history human parents apparently teach their own children without softening it for comfort. She showed me two terrible wars that had once nearly ended their entire world, fought not against any other species but against each other, spread across their whole planet, lasting years, touching nearly every family alive during them. She showed me the weapon they had built near the end of the second of those wars, one capable of ending an entire city in the space of a single breath, and the plain fact that they had actually used it. That ending was not distant history to them the way our own old wars have become to us. It was recent. It was remembered on purpose, carefully, not by accident. I asked her the question Dravoth himself would have asked, the only question that truly made sense to a mind trained the way mine had been. If that weapon frightened them so deeply, why keep any part of it at all? Why not simply destroy every last piece of it and be done with the memory completely? She said something then that I have turned over carefully in my thoughts every day since. She told me that a species which forgets exactly how far it once went is a species quietly waiting to discover that same terrible ceiling again, usually at the worst possible moment, and usually at someone else's hand rather than its own choosing. Humanity, she said, had already found their ceiling once, and paid a price for it that shaped every generation that came afterward. They did not disarm completely after that, and they did not celebrate what they had built either. Instead, they built something quieter, a doctrine, a discipline, an entire shared culture built carefully around one promise, that they would carry that power forward, but never again reach for it first. Their strongest ships, she told me gently, were never named for pride. They were named deliberately for grief, so that no young officer serving proudly aboard one of them could ever fully forget what that name had once cost their people. The very ship that had disabled our fleet so precisely carried a name chosen for exactly this reason. It was not a threat aimed outward at us. It was a quiet reminder aimed inward, at themselves. She told me this was not only a rule written for their soldiers. Every human child learned some version of that history in school, she said, not as a warning about outsiders, but as a warning about themselves. It was taught the way a family might teach a child about a terrible accident that once nearly ended it, carefully and honestly, without ever pretending it had not happened. I found this harder to understand than anything else she told me that day. My own people did not teach our children about our failures. We taught them about our victories and left the rest in silence. I asked her, as carefully as I could manage, why they had bothered responding to us at all, if restraint mattered so deeply to them. Corwin's Reach was a small colony after all. Its loss could easily have been absorbed in silence, the way so many small border losses are absorbed by larger, older empires like my own. She told me that restraint was never the same thing as surrender. Humanity would not strike first, she said, not against my people, not against anyone, no matter how old or how deep the provocation ran. But they would also never again be a species left standing without an answer ready, because the day they had none prepared was the exact day someone would come looking for the true edge of their patience, and find it the hardest possible way, at a terrible cost to everyone involved. Their strength, she said, was never meant as a threat to anyone. It was a quiet promise instead, kept faithfully day after day, precisely so that it would never once have to be spoken loudly. I asked her one last question before I left her ship, quieter than the others. I asked if she believed her own people would ever be tested past that promise, forced to choose between it and something worse. She thought about this for a long moment before answering. She said she hoped never to find out, and that hoping was not the same as being unprepared. That answer has stayed with me longer than any other part of our conversation. I did not sleep well during the days before my return. I kept replaying those 11 minutes in my mind, not the failure of our weapons, but the silence afterward. The total absence of cruelty, when cruelty would have cost them nothing at all. I had spent my whole career believing that mercy shown to a defeated enemy was itself a kind of weakness. I no longer believed that, though I was not yet sure what to believe instead. I was returned to Dominion space 11 days later, aboard a small shuttle that human crews had resupplied and quietly repaired without ever being asked, and without a word of comment afterward. Fleet Marshal Dravoth did not meet me at the landing bay when I arrived home. I learned later that he had already begun writing his own official report, one that carefully described our engagement as a controlled test with acceptable losses, nothing more, nothing worth dwelling on. I wrote a very different report of my own. I do not know yet if the Dominion Council will read it fully, or whether they will act on anything I have said in it, but I wrote, as plainly and as honestly as I could, that the galaxy had spent an entire century asking the wrong question about humanity. We had asked why they never chose war, as though peace were simply something they lacked the strength to break whenever they wished. The real truth was far harder to sit with, and far more humbling to accept. They had already fought the only war that ever truly mattered to them, once, against themselves, and it had cost them everything a war can possibly cost a people. They did not walk away from it unmarked. They walked away from it changed completely, and they had spent every year since making certain they would never have to walk that same road twice. I still do not know if my report will change how the Dominion behaves toward humanity going forward. Old empires are slow to admit a century of misunderstanding, and slower still to admit that the species we underestimated for so long understood the true cost of war more deeply than any of us ever had. But I know exactly what I witnessed during those 11 minutes of silence above Corwin's Reach, and I know exactly what I heard afterward, aboard that quiet human ship. Humanity did not avoid war because they were weak, or broken, or tired in the way Dravoth had always believed. They avoided it because they alone, among every people I have ever known, had already seen precisely where that road ends, and had chosen, quietly, every day since, not to walk it again unless someone forced their hand completely. That is the answer the entire galaxy finally learned. I am simply the one who happened to be there when it did, and the one who finally had to sit down and write it clearly, so that no one after me could pretend not to know it anymore.